Nobody warned them. That is the thing nobody ever says out loud. The generation born between 1981 and 1996 walked into a world that kept changing the rules mid-game, and somehow they were expected to keep up, stay grateful, and smile while doing it. Millennials are the most studied, most criticized, and most misunderstood generation in modern history, and the real psychology behind their behavior. Nobody actually talks about it. Let us start at the beginning. Because the foundation of millennial psychology was built in childhood, and that foundation had cracks in it from day one. These were kids raised during the self-esteem movement, a cultural shift where parents and teachers were told to make children feel special, capable, and limitless. On the surface, that sounds beautiful. Underneath it, it created an entire generation that grew up believing the world would reward their effort and their identity. Then they graduated, then they entered the real world, and the world looked them dead in the eye and said, "That is not how this works." That collision, between what they were promised and what they received, is the psychological earthquake that defines almost everything about millennial behavior. There is a term in psychology called cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time. Millennials live inside cognitive dissonance every single day. They were told education is the key to success, so they took on student debt that would follow them for decades. They were told hard work pays off, so they worked harder than any generation before them, often at multiple jobs simultaneously. They were told the economy would reward loyalty, and then they watched companies lay off entire departments without blinking. The mental weight of building your life on promises that were never honored is not laziness. It is grief. It is a quiet, constant grief that most millennials carry without ever naming it. And then there is the trauma no one discusses. Millennials were the first generation to experience mass tragedy in real time. September 11th happened when the oldest millennials were barely 20 years old and the youngest were just 5. They watched it on television, and then they watched it again and again, because the news could not stop replaying it. That event rewired something in the collective millennial nervous system. It introduced a low-grade, ever-present anxiety about safety, about the future, about the stability of the world they were inheriting, and that anxiety never fully left. It just evolved, shifting from terrorism to financial collapse in 2008, then to a global pandemic, then to climate crisis. Millennials have not been anxious without reason. They have been anxious because they have had a front row seat to a world that keeps falling apart. The 2008 financial crisis deserves its own conversation, because it did not just affect millennial bank accounts. It restructured millennial psychology at a cellular level. Many millennials were entering the workforce for the first time, degrees in hand, ready to begin the life they had been promised. Instead, they graduated into a recession. They moved back home. They took unpaid internships. They watched their parents lose homes and retirement savings. The psychological imprint of that experience is called scarcity mindset, a deep, almost irrational fear that there will never be enough, that security is always one crisis away from disappearing. This is why millennials check their bank accounts obsessively. This is why they struggle to spend money without guilt. This is why financial anxiety is one of the defining mental health issues of the entire generation. It is not a personality flaw. It is a survival response. Now let us talk about relationships. Because millennial relationship psychology is something that gets mocked constantly and understood almost never. Millennials are getting married later, having children later, and forming deep commitments later than any previous generation. The cultural narrative says they are commitment phobic, selfish, or too focused on themselves. The psychological reality is something entirely different. Millennials watch divorce rates peak during their childhood. Many of them grew up in broken homes, navigating split families and complicated dynamics that taught them at a very young age that love is not always enough. They are not afraid of commitment. They are afraid of committing to the wrong thing and losing everything. The way they watched the adults around them lose everything. They are choosing slowly because they have already seen what happens when people choose fast. There is also the identity crisis that sits at the heart of millennial psychology, and it is one of the most uncomfortable truths to sit with. Millennials were the first generation to grow up with the internet as a mirror. Social media gave them a platform to perform their identity, to curate who they were, to seek validation from strangers in real time. And while that sounds shallow when described that way, what it actually created was a generation deeply entangled with external validation, not because they are narcissistic, but because they were developmentally shaped in an environment where likes and comments became the language of worthiness. The psychological consequence is significant. Many millennials struggle with a stable sense of self because their identity was formed in public, constantly reshaped by feedback, comparison, and the pressure to be relatable, interesting, and authentic all at once. That is an impossible standard, and the mental health cost of living up to it is enormous. Speaking of mental health, millennials are the generation that broke the silence. They are the ones who started saying the words out loud: therapy, anxiety, depression, burnout. They are the ones who normalized asking for help in a way their parents never could. And that is not weakness. That is courage dressed up as vulnerability. But here is the painful irony. Millennials normalized mental health conversations, while simultaneously being the most burned out generation in the workforce. The hustle culture they inherited told them their value was tied to their productivity. Rest was laziness. Ambition was survival. And so they worked, and they grind. And they burned through themselves trying to prove that they were not the failure the world kept implying they were. The therapy they needed was often a direct result of the system they could not afford to leave. There is something else. Something quieter and harder to articulate. Millennials are a generation in mourning for a future that was never delivered. They grew up watching movies and television shows that depicted a very specific version of adulthood. Stable careers by 30, home ownership, financial security, a sense of arrival. None of that arrived on schedule. Many millennials are in their late 30s and early 40s still waiting. Still working toward a version of stability that feels permanently just out of reach. That gap between expected life and lived life creates a psychological wound called ambiguous loss. The grief of losing something you never quite had, mourning a timeline that dissolved before you could step into it. What makes millennials genuinely remarkable, and this part matters, is that they adapted. They did not just survive the collapse of the promises made to them. They rebuilt their definition of success. They are the generation that invented the side hustle, not because they are greedy, but because one income stopped being enough. They are the generation that started asking whether work-life balance is real, not because they are lazy, but because they watched their parents sacrifice everything for companies that discarded them anyway. They are the generation that looked at the blueprint of a good life and said, "This does not work for us," and then started drawing a new one. Understanding millennial psychology is not about excusing behavior or assigning blame. It is about recognizing that an entire generation was shaped by forces beyond their control, that their anxiety is rational, their grief is legitimate, and their need for meaning is not entitlement. It is the natural result of being handed a world in crisis and told to make something beautiful out of it. The psychology of millennials is the psychology of resilience that no one applauded. It is the quiet strength of people who kept going when the ground kept shifting. And the fact that nobody talks about it, that is perhaps the most millennial thing of all.